Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connolly. Thank you very much for listening. This is part 7 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled Divided Loyalties. Typically, I'd have housekeeping announcements to make here at the top of the show, but there's not really much that I have to say at the moment. I apologize for last week's episode being late, but as I said, there was a medical issue that prevented me from recording. The 12th and final episode of the Korean War series has been written and recorded, I assure you, but right now it's just a matter of getting the audio edited, which is a lengthy and tedious process even when episodes are half the length of the one that I'm working with now. At the moment, I'm prioritizing getting this current series on Lafayette released on a regular basis, but rest assured it is coming down the line. Just be patient a little while longer. With any luck, it'll be out before the end of the year. In the previous episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we covered events from about January 1782, when Lafayette returned to France after the Battle of Yorktown, up to December 1784, when his first post-war visit to the United States came to a close. To recap, although our protagonist helped lead the Americans to victory in their War of Independence, in his mind, his work on behalf of his adoptive nation was never over. After returning to France in early 1782, Lafayette assisted American diplomats in peace negotiations with Great Britain. These negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Paris, which went into effect in May 1784. While Lafayette can't be given too much individual credit for this result, his persistent efforts to promote American interests in France, most notably by securing a more favorable arrangement for American merchants trying to do business in the country, did not go unnoticed or unappreciated. As the late Prime Minister, the Comte de Maurepas, once put it, quote, "He was ready to strip France bare to clothe his beloved America," end quote. In 1784, Lafayette decided to pay an extended visit to the United States, to see the result of his efforts, the country finally free from the yoke of Great Britain and the hardships of war. His visit lasted a total of about 5 months, during which time he attended festivities thrown in his honor in practically every major city, spoke before Congress and the Virginia House of Delegates, took part in a diplomatic mission to the Iroquois Confederacy, and spent time in the company of his friends, especially his beloved General Washington, whose estate at Mount Vernon Lafayette stayed at for 2 weeks. By all accounts, the Marquis had a wonderful time and was quite sad to take his leave by the end of it, but he took some solace in the thought that he would be able to visit semi-regularly in the future. Upon returning to France in the first days of 1785, Lafayette was fired with newfound zeal to take a more active role in the political affairs of his native country. It had been 4 years since Charles Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown, and 8 since Lafayette first traveled to the New World in search of fame and glory. At that time, the 19-year-old Marquis possessed only vague notions of what the American project represented, of what the ideas of liberty and equality actually meant. Now that he had grown older and wiser, he had had time to reflect on these things. His political beliefs began to take on a more concrete form, even if they were not always the most sophisticated or even practical. And what exactly were his convictions, such as they were at this time? Simply put, he wished to recreate America in France, or, to be more precise, to reform France into a more just and equitable society along American lines. One may be inclined to attribute his newfound inspiration for this task to his visit to the United States, having witnessed democracy in practice, but that explanation by itself may downplay the growing sense among certain segments of French society that their system of government was deeply dysfunctional and in desperate need of reform. Lafayette was not the only would-be reformer to whom America appeared as an example that could be emulated. Steeped in ideas of universalism, inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they held to the belief that America's experiment with democracy could be just as easily replicated in France. Take, for instance, the following quote from Lafayette's old friend, the Comte de Ségur, written to his wife in 1780, shortly before he left for America along with the Comte de Rochambeau's army. Quote, "Arbitrary power weighs heavily on me. The freedom for which I am going to fight inspires in me the liveliest enthusiasm, and I would like my own country to enjoy such a liberty that would be compatible with our monarchy." End quote. What Ségur and the many others who thought like him, Lafayette included, failed to consider was the vast difference of political realities in the two countries, that the notion of liberty had very different connotations in the Old World than it did in the New. In Fuye and Babeau's biography, they quote from an interview given to a group of French officers a short time after the Battle of Yorktown by a Boston clergyman named Samuel Cooper. Quote, "Beware, young men, lest the triumph of liberty in this virgin land inflame your hopes too much. You will carry the seed of these generous sentiments, but if you try to germinate it in your native soil, after so many centuries of corruption, you will have great obstacles to overcome. It has cost us much blood to win liberty here, but you will spill torrents of it before you can establish it in Europe." End quote. Writing with the benefit of several years' worth of retrospect, Ségur, realizing his error, would write, quote, "We stepped gaily onto a carpet of flowers, little imagining the abyss underneath." End quote. But as of 1785, all of that, the revolutionary upheaval, the torrents of blood, and the abyss and whatnot, that was all still a few years out, and Lafayette remained as optimistic as ever. As I mentioned, he returned to France inspired to become a political reformer. We already discussed this a bit in the previous episode, when we discussed his advocacy for free trade between France and the United States. Now he had found a new cause to champion, the rights of Protestants in France. To explain, Catholicism was the state religion of France prior to the Revolution. After a period of bloody civil conflict, the 1598 Edict of Nantes extended religious toleration to French Protestants, referred to as Huguenots, who made up a sizable minority in the country. Less than a century later, in 1685, King Louis XIV revoked the edict, thereby depriving Protestants in France of their civil rights. This resulted in a mass exodus of Huguenots from the country, with many immigrating to the New World. If you'll recall from the second episode, the Huger family, the first people Lafayette encountered upon reaching the United States, were descendants of Huguenot settlers, as their surname implies. As far as I can tell, restrictions against Protestants' freedom of worship applied to all, not just those born in France, and this caused some complications for foreigners residing in the country. This brings us to Lafayette's personal connection to the issue. As you'll recall from the last episode, when he returned from his visit to the United States, he brought along with him two young Moors, a 12-year-old Native American boy from the Onondaga Nation named Kainlaha, and an orphaned 14-year-old from New Jersey named John Edwards Caldwell. We talked about Kainlaha at length in the previous episode, but as for Caldwell, Lafayette had the boy enrolled in an elite Parisian boarding school, which allowed him to return home on weekends and holidays. Each time he returned, Caldwell would report to his guardian that the Benedictine monks who ran the school were constantly trying to force him to attend daily Catholic religious services. Caldwell, as the son of a Protestant minister, was very much attached to his particular faith. Lafayette fought a running battle against the school's administration to allow the boy to maintain his religious affiliation. Lafayette had been baptized Catholic, but like many among the educated classes of France, he was not devoutly religious by any stretch of the imagination. He'd befriended many Protestants during his time in America, and was quite upset on their behalf for the way that their people were treated by the French government, as he described in a letter to Washington, dated May 11th, 1785, quote, "Protestants in France live under intolerable despotism. Although open persecution does not now exist, yet it depends upon the whim of the king, queen, parliament, and the ministries. Marriages are not legal among them, their wills have no force by law, their children are to be bastards, their parsons are to be hanged. I have put it into my head to become a leader in that affair, and to have their situation changed." End quote. Lafayette began to meet with leaders of the Huguenot community who remained in France after the Edict of Nantes was revoked. Despite also being Catholic, and a practicing one at that, Adrienne happily joined her husband in his advocacy. Her daughter Virginie wrote, quote, "My mother shared his beliefs, and received with great warmth the Protestant ministers that often came to our door because of his work. My mother's tolerance was based upon the principles of her own religion. She believed it was a heinous crime to interfere with the liberties that God granted to all men." End quote. But by far, the cause about which Lafayette was most passionate was the abolition of slavery. We first talked about Lafayette's evolving views on slavery in the previous episode, but to update that discussion, his anti-slavery convictions only became more and more intense as time went on, especially after his visit to the United States in 1784. Upon his return from that trip, Lafayette became increasingly involved in the international abolitionist movement. He sought to become an expert on all things slavery and abolition, and read every work that he could find on these subjects. One of these works was a pamphlet entitled Reflections on the Slavery of Negroes, published in 1781. Referring to this as a pamphlet is a bit misleading, as this is a rather lengthy tract, spanning 100 pages and 12 chapters, in the course of which the author attempts to systematically dismantle arguments in favor of slavery. The author, who originally published the pamphlet under a pseudonym, was Nicolas de Catria, Marquis de Condorcet. Typically just referred to as Condorcet, he was an influential mathematician and political scientist, and as such, his pamphlet focused on proving how slavery as an institution was irrational. Lafayette read Reflections in 1783, and was subsequently introduced to Condorcet through a mutual friend. Condorcet was another contact in a growing network of abolitionist activists, both in France and outside of it, that Lafayette was becoming a part of. One notable individual who was, if not a part of this network, at least adjacent to it, was John Adams. Adams is notable as being one of the few members of the founding generation of the United States who did not own slaves. More than that, he opposed slavery on principle, though he did not openly advocate for abolition for pragmatic reasons. In any event, after Adams was given a new assignment as the ambassador to Great Britain in 1785, Lafayette wrote to him asking if he could send him any recent abolitionist literature he could, since Britain was home to the oldest and most influential abolitionist organizations. Adams duly had one of his aides collect the literature that Lafayette asked for, and had an entire crate of books shipped to Paris. His thank you letter to Adams is, I think, rather revealing in regards to the issue of slavery and its incongruity with the ideals of the American Revolution, as Lafayette perceived it. Quote, "Thank you for the valuable books you took the trouble to find for me. In the case of my black brethren, I feel myself warmly interested, and most decidedly side, so far as respects them, against the white part of mankind. Whatever the complexion of the enslaved may be, it does not, in my opinion, alter the complexion of the crime which the slaver commits, a crime much blacker than any African face. It is a matter of great anxiety and concern to find this trend is perpetrated under the flag of liberty, our dear stars and noble stripes." End quote. As I've said many times before, slavery was the great contradiction at the heart of the American Revolution, a fact that Lafayette had recognized years prior and was just now beginning to see the international ramifications of. If he hoped to advance his agenda of reshaping France in America's image, the continued existence of slavery in the United States had the potential to fatally undermine the credibility of that cause. Already, European conservatives had demonstrated that they were not above using the issue as a rhetorical cudgel. Take, for instance, the words of one pro-British polemical tract published in the Netherlands during the War of Independence. Quote, "If the Americans are fighting for freedom, then why do they not set free their black slaves? Why do they participate themselves in that accursed trade in human beings? Or do Africa's ill-fated inhabitants, transported against their will to American shores, possess none of the natural rights that white men do? Does their reluctance to liberate them not demonstrate in the plainest fashion the vile hypocrisy and most crafty duplicity of the Americans?" End quote. To Lafayette and others like him in France who looked to the United States for inspiration, slavery was not just a moral travesty, it was also a political liability. Hence why, when Lafayette made up his mind to involve himself more in French politics, he became more vocal with his anti-slavery activism. Since he could count some of the most powerful individuals in both France and the United States as personal friends, he hoped that he could use these connections to further the cause. These efforts yielded no tangible results, and after a certain point, Lafayette realized that a more hands-on approach was necessary. In late 1785, Lafayette finally took steps to enact the experiment that he had initially proposed to Washington in 1783. He purchased 2 plantation-type properties in the South American colony of French Guiana, near the administrative center of Cayenne, one called La Maripa and another called Saint-Régy, the latter of which he rechristened as L'Adrienne in honor of his wife. He paid 125,000 livres for the land itself and for the slaves who worked it, of whom there were, at the time of the purchase, 48. Lafayette's plan was not to free these slaves immediately. Instead, he planned to carry out a scheme of gradual emancipation more in line with the proposals of the mainstream abolitionist movement. After taking over the management of these plantations, Lafayette saw to it that the slaves were treated fairly. Corporal punishment was forbidden, as was the selling of slaves. Educational programs were instituted for both the adults and children, and most importantly, the workers were to be paid a fair wage according to their productivity. Lafayette never personally paid a visit to his properties in Cayenne, and instead delegated the day-to-day administration to a 29-year-old geographical engineer named Jean-François-Henri de Richepre. To a large degree, Lafayette's plan hinged on the slaves being able to live self-sufficiently after emancipation, and with this goal in mind, Richepre recommended that Lafayette purchase additional property in order to make the plantations economically viable. Lafayette heeded this advice, and in 1786, with a loan borrowed from the French government, he purchased another plantation called La Belle Gabrielle, along with an additional 22 slaves. For those of you keeping track, this brought the total number of slaves involved in the scheme up to 70 between the three plantations. As with her husband's other ongoing efforts, Adrienne eagerly assisted in this abolitionist experiment. Their daughter, Virginie, later wrote of her role in the project, quote, "My mother had a deep need to propagate good and was horrified by all injustice. She was thrilled by my father's decision to work towards the abolition of the slave trade. When he brought La Belle Gabrielle, as the properties were referred to collectively, her zealous belief in just and liberal ideas made her search ardently for means to put these ideas into immediate practice." End quote. In fact, as Lafayette found himself increasingly preoccupied in the years that followed, Adrienne would take a more active role in managing the properties. As Virginie lamented, quote, "If only we still had her correspondence, we would be able to see the good work that she had started and was planning to continue." End quote. Lafayette's ultimate goal with this experiment went beyond just freeing those 70 or so slaves in South America. He hoped that by demonstrating that these people were able to live healthy and prosperous lives when given more humane conditions, an example would be set that the rest of the Atlantic world would eventually follow. Washington's remarks on Lafayette's project were simultaneously laudatory and apprehensive. Quote, "The goodness of your heart displays itself in all circumstances, and I am never surprised when you provide new proof of it. Your acquisition of a plantation in Cayenne, with a view to emancipating the slaves, is a generous and noble proof of your humanity. God grant that a similar spirit will someday animate the people of this country, but I despair of ever seeing that happen. A few petitions for the abolition of slavery were presented to the last session of the Virginia Assembly, but they barely obtained a reading. Sudden emancipation would bring many evils, I believe, but it certainly could be, and should be, accomplished gradually, and by legislative authority." End quote. In the summer of 1785, Lafayette received an invitation from the King of Prussia, Frederick II, better known as Frederick the Great, to attend the annual training maneuvers of the legendary Prussian army at Potsdam, near Berlin. Also in attendance were the Duke of York, the son of King George III of Britain, and Lafayette's old adversary, Lord Charles Cornwallis. At first it may seem odd that the absolutist King of Prussia would extend an invitation to the Marquis, who was known across Europe as a liberal-minded revolutionary. But upon closer observation, it can be surmised that, by doing so, Frederick was attempting to further cultivate his public image as an enlightened monarch, one who openly embraced certain aspects of the liberal agenda. In the long course of his rule, Frederick had made a reputation for himself as Europe's greatest contemporary military leader, having led his kingdom to victory against overwhelming odds during the 7 Years' War. But upon encountering the 73-year-old monarch in person, Lafayette expressed disappointment at his appearance. Quote, "Despite all that I had heard about him, I was stunned by his clothing and appearance. He was like an old, dirty and decrepit corporal, covered in Spanish snuff, his head bent to one side onto his shoulder and his fingers practically dislocated by gout." End quote. But once the maneuvers commenced, Lafayette had the opportunity to observe Frederick in his natural element. Quote, "When he is at the head of his army, I was surprised by the fire and occasional calmness in the most magnificent eyes I had ever seen, which gave his face an expression at once captivating and brutal." End quote. Lafayette was just as impressed by the army itself. Writing to Washington, he said, quote, "Nothing can compare to the magnificence of the Prussian troops, to the discipline that reigns in all of their ranks. It is a fine-tuned machine. With every imaginable situation in war and every appropriate reaction inculcated in their heads, they respond like machines. This entire journey was very useful for my military education." End quote. The guests were invited to a banquet following the conclusion of each day's maneuvers. The hosts intentionally had Lafayette seated between Lord Cornwallis and the Duke of York, and directed all manner of questions to him regarding the United States and its War of Independence. Cornwallis was rather offended by this arrangement, writing, quote, "My reception was not flattering. There is a most marked preference for Lafayette." End quote. Towards the end of his visit, during a conversation with the king, the subject of republicanism came up. Frederick took the opportunity to tell a cautionary tale to his guest. Quote, "Sir, I once knew a young man who, after having visited countries where liberty and equality reigned, got it into his head to establish them in his own country. Do you know what happened to him? Why, sir, he was hanged." End quote. From Potsdam, Lafayette went to the Austrian capital of Vienna, where he stayed as a guest of the Emperor Joseph II, the brother of Lafayette's own queen, Marie Antoinette. Like his Prussian counterpart, Joseph II was one of that new breed of monarchs known as enlightened despots or enlightened absolutists, who claimed to wield their monarchical power on behalf of their subjects' well-being. As such, he had little issue with Lafayette and the values that he stood for. His more conservative brother and heir apparent, the Archduke Francis, was less sympathetic to liberalism, and as we'll see in the future, he would be afforded an opportunity to punish Lafayette for promoting these dangerous ideas that dragged France and all of Europe into catastrophe. From Vienna, Lafayette took a circuitous route back home, trekking through Bohemia and Saxony before returning to Paris. In December 1786, Lafayette was planning another trip abroad, this time to Russia. His friend, the Comte de Ségur, had joined the diplomatic corps upon returning from America, and at that time was serving as the ambassador to the Russian Empire, the current ruler of which was Catherine the Great, another enlightened monarch in the mold of Frederick and Joseph. She had heard of the Marquis de Lafayette and was interested in meeting him, so she extended the invitation to join her entourage as they went on a tour of the Crimean Peninsula. But as Lafayette was busy packing his bags, on December 27th, a summons from the King of France forced him to cancel his plans. In response to an imminent economic crisis in the kingdom, King Louis XVI had called for an assembly of notables, that is to say, a gathering of the most influential members of the nobility, clergy, and bureaucracy, to consult with them regarding the issue. This was a relatively rare occurrence in French history, but not entirely unheard of. That said, the last time an assembly of notables had been convened was in 1626. Now, in a previous episode of this series, I believe it was episode 5, I briefly discussed the impending financial crisis in France, insofar as it pertained to the American Revolution. So if any of this sounds familiar, that is why, but a more in-depth discussion is warranted for the narrative going forward. Essentially, a series of poor financial decisions had all but emptied the French treasury. The most consequential of these was undoubtedly the decision to intervene in North America on behalf of the United States. War is a massively costly enterprise, and this was no exception. It is estimated that France's involvement in the American Revolutionary War had cost the state 1.3 billion livres, a figure which alone surpassed its annual income that, it must be noted, came from a highly antiquated and inefficient system of taxation. These problems had existed for years already, decades even, but went largely ignored by the king and his ministers until recently. In 1774, Louis XVI had invited a man named Jacques Turgot, a proponent of economic liberalism, to serve as the finance minister, to modernize the kingdom's economy. He served in that capacity for only 2 years before being forced out of office. His successor was the Swiss banker Jacques Necker, who, in February 1781, published the Compte Rendu, or the Report to the King. The Report to the King purported to be a comprehensive accounting of the kingdom's finances. Necker's conclusions in this report were that the kingdom was actually in fine shape financially and there was nothing to worry about. A short time later, Necker ran afoul of some powerful people at court and was forced out of office. The next person to walk through the revolving door of the Ministry of Finance was a lawyer named Charles-Alexandre de Calonne. Upon assuming the office, Calonne took a closer look at the ledgers and realized that the Compte Rendu was, in fact, a highly misleading document. Necker had simply written off the massive debt incurred by the kingdom as a result for its support of the United States as miscellaneous expenses. Calonne realized that something had to be done, and he devised a rather unorthodox strategy to resolve the issue. Given that interest payments accounted for more than 50% of the kingdom's annual expenditures, Calonne thought it would be possible to ease the immediate situation by taking out loans with lower interest rates to pay off the debt incurred by the current higher interest loans. But to secure new lines of credit, the monarchy had to project an outward image of financial solvency, so to this end, Calonne signed off on massive new expenditures with the intention of demonstrating to potential creditors the healthy state of the monarchy's finances, a policy unofficially referred to as useful splendor. Even though there was a certain logic to Calonne's plan, it was still a highly risky one that ultimately backfired and sent the monarchy even deeper into debt. By August 1786, Calonne could tell that bankruptcy was imminent. At the end of that year, the vingtième, a universal income tax of 5% that was originally implemented in 1756 to finance the 7 Years' War, was set to expire. Without this income, the monarchy would be entirely unable to break even. This was the state of affairs in which Calonne, and by extension the monarchy itself, found themselves in by 1786. They had been pressed into a corner with no simple way to avoid the looming crisis. Now, I'm sure some might be wondering why the king did not simply impose new taxes on his subjects by royal decree. After all, pre-revolutionary France was an absolutist monarchy, where the sovereign was empowered to take such drastic actions, at least in theory. It's worth stressing that last "in theory" part. Despite all the efforts towards centralization that had been made by French monarchs of decades past, the power of the French monarch, while theoretically absolute, was not so in practice. There were a number of checks on the king's power. Some of these were institutional, like the Catholic Church, while others were not so well defined, local feudal customs or the ever-present threat of revolt. Calonne was acutely aware of these restraints on the king's power. He knew above all that an attempt to reform the system of taxation by royal fiat would be met with resistance, and that the Parlement would lead the charge. In order to understand what these Parlements were, one must first understand that in French, the word Parlement has a different meaning from the English word Parliament. Unlike in the English context, where Parliament refers to a legislative body, typically at a national level, in France the Parlements were judicial bodies, regional courts of law. 13 in total existed throughout the kingdom, with the most important being centered in Paris. The Parlements, specifically the Parlement of Paris, held a unique power to challenge royal authority in that any and all new laws decreed by the king had to be approved by the Parlement of Paris before they could be enacted. Previous French monarchs had been able to effectively restrain the power of the Parlement, and throughout the reign of Louis XIV, they had been rendered more or less defunct. Under his less forceful successors, the Parlement had become regional focal points of noble opposition to royal absolutism. Calonne desperately wished to avoid having to deal with the Parlement, since he knew that they would do whatever they could to obstruct his objectives. But what other options lay open to him? Calonne may have considered convoking the Estates General. Similar to the Parlement, the Estates General was a vestige of the kingdom's feudal past. From the first time when such a body was convened in 1302 and the year 1614, the Estates General had been convened over 30 times. But as of that year, one had not been convened in over a century and a half. The Estates General was a consultative assembly of elected representatives of the entire kingdom, divided on the basis of 3 classes, or estates: the clergy, which was the first estate, the nobility, which was the second, and everyone else that made up the third estate. Calonne had his reservations when it came to convening the Estates General. He feared that such a body would be effectively impossible to control. And as anyone with a passing familiarity with the French Revolution knows, Calonne's hesitancy to convening the Estates General was, as it would turn out, absolutely justified. Eventually, he decided on a different solution. He would ask the king to call for an assembly of notables, which, an assembly of notables, was basically exactly what it sounded like. A convocation of the kingdom's notables, that is to say, members of the nobility, clergy, and bureaucracy. Like the Estates General, its powers were consultative, but unlike the Estates General, the members of the Assembly of Notables were not elected. Rather, they were hand-selected by the king. Because of this, Calonne was certain that the crown would be able to easily control the agenda, that the assembly would do what they were told, that is to say, to rubber stamp any new taxes or legislation the king and his ministers deemed necessary. The added benefit of this course of action was that the assembly offered the crown a veil of legitimacy to hide behind. Whatever new laws came about as a result of the Assembly of Notables would be seen by the public as being more legitimate than an arbitrary pronouncement of the king, even if, in effect, that was what was happening anyway. And so, in the waning days of 1786, Calonne convinced Louis XVI to call for an Assembly of Notables. Calonne immediately got to work drawing up a list of invitations. Lafayette was rather excited by the prospects of this once-in-a-lifetime event, and he wrote the following in a letter to Washington, quote, "There will be 144 members, archbishops, bishops, nobles, presidents of various parlements, mayors of various towns. The king's letter announces an examination of finances to be adjusted, of the means to alleviate the taxes of the people, and of the many abuses to be redressed. You can easily conceive that there is at bottom a desire to make money somehow or other, in order to put the receipt on a level with expenses, which in this country has become enormous on account of the sums squandered on couriers and superfluities." End quote. Lafayette was very nearly excluded from the assembly, but his name was added to the list at the last moment. The reasons for this are a matter of speculation. The most reasonable explanation would be on account of his age. It would stand to reason that the king and his advisors would pass over Lafayette, then just 29 years old, in favor of someone older and more experienced. Thomas Jefferson, who was by that time serving as the American ambassador to France, offered an alternative explanation. Quote, His education in our school has drawn on him a very jealous eye from a court whose principles are the most absolute despotism." End quote. Other observers had an entirely different read on the situation. They knew well that Lafayette was an intimate friend of the royal family. He had once been classmates with Charles Philippe, the Comte d'Artois. His acquaintanceship with Queen Marie Antoinette went back far, and he had become a close personal associate of the king. They thought that Lafayette would be, quote, coached by the Noailles, and would be counseled to the side of the court and not compromise, end quote. For his part, Lafayette's aims were not revolutionary in nature, but reformist, and fairly modest at that. Writing to Washington in February, he described the reforms that he hoped to have enacted, which were limited to the creation of representative assemblies in the provinces, the abolition of internal tariffs and other trade restrictions, and maybe, if they were really lucky, the extension of civil rights to Protestants. On April 13, 1787, a mere few days before the assembly was scheduled to convene, the crown was struck by tragedy. The prime minister, the Comte de Vergennes, died. The king was deeply upset by the news, breaking down in tears and declaring that Vergennes had been, quote, the only friend that I could count on, the one minister who's never deceived me, end quote. Vergennes had indeed been a constant fixture in the king's cabinet since he was first appointed as foreign minister in 1774, shortly after Louis ascended to the throne. Over the years, he had come to rely heavily on Vergennes as a trusted advisor, with his steady confidence often proving a decisive counterweight to the king's frequent indecisiveness. For his part, Lafayette was also upset by the loss of Vergennes, as the late minister had been a frequent correspondent for Lafayette and a key contact within the higher ranks of the government. But by far, the person who would most acutely feel his absence was the king himself, as he would be going into the Assembly of Notables, deprived of the one minister whose counsel he trusted the most. And so, on February 22, 1787, the Assembly of Notables was convened, in a building known as the Menu Plaisir du Roi, a building in Versailles not far from the main palace that housed the bureau for the lesser pleasures of the king. Primarily, the building that housed the assembly was used as a warehouse for storing some of the various backdrops and props employed daily in the elaborate royal ceremonies at Versailles. Naturally, the Menu Plaisir was a potent symbol of the monarchy's wasteful spending, and the irony of this building being selected to host a meeting intended to address the debt crisis should be self-evident. The building had, of course, been suitably redecorated for the occasion, with tapestries and coats of arms abounding, and the king's throne at the center. That morning at 10, the king strode into the hall and gave some brief opening remarks, wherein he beseeched the help of the assembly in enacting a number of social, economic, and political reforms to the kingdom. Once the king concluded his address, Cologne took center stage. Cologne effectively reiterated what Louis had said, stressing the fact that the monarchy was deeply in debt and that something had to be done immediately to avert a crisis. After this, the assembly was divided into 7 bureaus for deliberation, each headed by a royal prince. Lafayette's particular bureau was headed by his former classmate, the Comte d'Artois. Things began promisingly enough. The nobles gave their approval to tax reforms, reducing the peasant income tax from 20 to 10%. They also approved abolishing the internal trade barriers for grain and establishing regional assemblies to give the provinces a greater measure of autonomy. However, when it came to the question of establishing new taxes, especially ones that potentially affected them, the nobles offered fierce resistance. The primary point of contention was a proposed permanent new land tax that would be applied to all without exception. The notables, representing as they did the richest elements of French society, saw themselves as disproportionately saddled with the burden of the monarchy's debt. In Lafayette's opinion, their rage was blind, based on nothing but pure pride. In a letter to Washington, he jokingly referred to the notables as the not-ables. And he was not the only one who was frustrated with the way that things were going. By the third week of the assembly, Cologne had lost control of the agenda. At this point, the notables were more preoccupied with calling out Cologne and the monarchy he represented for their hypocrisy. Here was the Minister of Finance, dressed extravagantly in the newest fashion, telling them all about how there was no money. They demanded to take a look behind the curtain, to peer at the ledgers themselves. They wanted to know exactly how the crown's budget was being spent. Naturally, they started to heap blame on Marie Antoinette, whom some had nicknamed Madame Deficit. The Queen's reckless personal spending habits had long been a focal point of criticism against the crown. Especially damaging to their reputation was the diamond necklace affair of 2 years prior, in which Marie Antoinette had been accused of participating in a scheme to defraud the royal jewelers out of a diamond necklace worth $15 million in modern US dollars. I won't delve into the intricacies of the scandal here, but suffice it to say that as a result, many now were inclined to view the crown's expenditures with a greater degree of scrutiny, and Marie Antoinette herself became the embodiment of royal profligacy. On March 12th, Calonne decided to try a new tactic. He delivered an address to the Assembly, during which he attempted to shift the discourse away from criticism of the monarchy and back to addressing the matter at hand. Quote, "The objections you have raised, and which relate to matters of form, do not contradict the essential points of the goal that His Majesty has proposed to improve his finances." End quote. Calonne's statement did not go over well. Over the next 4 days, each of the 7 individual bureaus worked furiously to draw up their own rebuttals to the finance minister's statement. They slightly varied in terms of tone and content, but overall their argument was the same. Their critiques of the crown spending were, in fact, relevant to the matter at hand, despite suggestions to the contrary. For the first month or so of the Assembly of Notables, Lafayette was intermittently absent from the proceedings. His absence, which had not gone unnoticed, was due to an illness. In the meantime, the debate in the meeting halls of Versailles had spilled over into the streets of Paris. There, crowds of commoners were being whipped up into a frenzy by fiery young rhetoricians, some of whom may be familiar to those who have previously studied the French Revolution, such as Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton. In April 1787, an anonymously authored pamphlet was published that provided details of a scheme in which certain individuals, with close ties to the court, had been buying properties at below market value and reselling them back to the crown for outrageous profits. Among those implicated were Marie Antoinette, the Comte d'Artois, and Calonne. The common people were the ones being forced to foot the bill. Seizing on this scandalous new report, Lafayette now took center stage. Standing before the Assembly, he voiced his critique of royal corruption. Quote, "I question why ministers of finance would recommend royal purchases of lands he could not possibly use. I might also ask why they are buying more property for the king, when most people agree that he should be selling the surplus land that he already owns." End quote. At this point, the Comte d'Artois tried to interject, urging Lafayette to tone down his rhetoric, but he pushed on. Quote, "My sense of patriotism is alarmed and demands a full inquiry. The millions being dissipated come from taxes, which cannot be justified except to meet the real needs of the state. The millions abandoned to plunder and greed are the fruit of sweat, blood, and tears of the people, and the number of people sacrificed to misery to amass the sums so carelessly wasted shames the sense of justice and goodness that we know to be the natural sentiments of His Majesty." End quote. Lafayette concluded his speech by reiterating his demands for an investigation, which the remainder of the body unanimously endorsed. Lafayette's little performance at the Assembly of Notables earned him the respect of the monarchy's opponents and the derision of its supporters. Lafayette alleged that Calonne had gone to the king and asked that he be arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille, but this did not come to pass, and it's possible that this was no more than mere hearsay. While the Assembly was on recess for the Easter holiday, King Louis had Calonne sacked as finance minister and exiled from Versailles. The king had been led to believe that the uproar in the Assembly had been solely on account of Calonne, and that now that he was out of the picture, the situation could be brought back under control. Louis had misjudged the situation. In fact, Calonne's presence had acted as a sort of lightning rod for the crown. With him gone, attacks that were previously directed towards him specifically were now directed towards the monarchy in general. In the following days, Lafayette delivered 2 further speeches before the Assembly. In the first of these, he argued against the imposition of new taxes. To exact new taxes from the population at large would be, in his words, to, quote, "reap a cruel harvest," end quote. Furthermore, whatever the state stood to gain by further squeezing the poorest of the king's subjects would be, quote, "a drop in the bucket compared to the profligacy and luxury of the court and the upper classes," end quote. He urged those present to imagine the plight of the average people. Quote, "Let us follow those millions into the country cottages, and we will see the last hope of sustenance for widows and orphans, the final burden that forces the farmer to abandon his plow, and a family of honest artisans to go out begging," end quote. In the second of his speeches, he outlined a number of austerity measures that the crown should adopt before considering the imposition of new taxes. Among other suggestions, Lafayette recommended that the crown stop handing out sinecures and other gifts to its favorites, that properties not in active use be sold or rented out, that the budget of the royal household be cut, and non-productive or unnecessary government ministries should be eliminated. Most notably, Lafayette also called for the closure of state prisons, a very radical proposition, but Lafayette believed that most of those imprisoned within these institutions were the victims of unjust laws, to begin with. Quote, "The king's heart would disavow these prisons, as well as the laws of the kingdom which had sent the prisoners there if he fully understood their uselessness and danger," end quote. By May of 1787, it was growing increasingly apparent to many, Lafayette included, that the scale of the issue at hand was such that the Assembly of Notables was incapable of adequately addressing it. Countless satirical tracts and prints circulated, mocking the Assembly for its impotence. One noteworthy print portrayed the members of the Assembly as a group of chickens, with a monkey in a chef's hat informing them, quote, "My dear creatures, I have assembled you here to deliberate with which sauce you want to be eaten," end quote. This mockery was so commonplace that it caused Jefferson to remark, quote, "The most noticeable effect of this convention as of yet is the number of puns and bon mots it has generated. I think that were they to be all collected, it would make a more voluminous work than the encyclopedia," end quote. In any event, in order to enact the reforms that were necessary, a body with actual legislative power was needed. It was at this point that Lafayette delivered one final address before the Assembly of Notables. He began, quote, "The rights of the nation outweigh the needs of the government. However great the love of the people for the king, it would be dangerous to think that the people's resources are inexhaustible. To cite my own province alone, I can assure the king that the inequalities of taxation are forcing farmers to abandon their plows, craftsmen to leave their shops, and depriving the most industrious citizens so much of their earnings that they have little choice but to move to other countries or to turn to begging. And in that part of the kingdom, it would be impossible to raise taxes without increasing their misery and despair," end quote. Then Lafayette brought his speech to a stunning conclusion. Quote, "Now is the moment. I appeal to each of your hearts. We can no longer avoid facing the enormous public catastrophe that is about to overrun our unhappy land. It seems to me that the time has come for us to beseech His Majesty to convene a National Assembly," end quote. A dread-filled silence filled the room as Lafayette uttered these fateful words. After a moment, the Comte d'Artois spoke up, asking Lafayette if he was demanding the convocation of the Estates General, to which Lafayette replied, quote, "Yes, my lord, and even more than that," end quote. To elaborate, what Lafayette was proposing here was the creation of an entirely new legislative body that would give more institutional power to the common people of France than the Estates General in its current form would allow for. By calling for a National Assembly, Lafayette was ahead of the curve, as such a radical notion was practically unthinkable to the group of people who just listened to his speech. As he later recalled, quote, "Seeing the effect produced by those two words uttered for the first time, it would not have been judged that about 2 years later they should reappear with a brilliance and a power which would fill France and the rest of the world," end quote. By all accounts, the Assembly of Notables had ended in an abject failure for the monarchy. When he made the suggestion to Louis XVI to call for the Assembly, Finance Minister Calonne believed that he had found the perfect solution to the Crown's dilemma. The Assembly was merely meant to put a stamp of approval on any measures the king and his ministers had already decided to take. This was emphatically not what had happened. Not only were new taxes not passed, but over the course of the Assembly, the public image of the monarchy had only been further besmirched. Opposition to the monarchy was now emanating not just from the common peasantry, but from the nobility as well. The ancien regime was being pushed ever further to the brink. For Lafayette personally, though, the Assembly of Notables could be considered a success. While nothing had really changed as a direct result, it nevertheless opened the door to exciting new possibilities for future reform efforts, in which Lafayette would almost certainly be leading the charge. The Assembly had also resulted in some negative personal ramifications for Lafayette. His outspoken opposition to royal absolutism had earned him the ire of the crown. It must be remembered that Lafayette was, up to this point, on quite intimate terms with the royal family, especially since his return to France in 1783. Lafayette's conduct during the Assembly had tarnished his once close relationships with the king and queen. They felt that he had betrayed their trust and friendship and increasingly came to view him as a dangerous radical. Henceforth, Lafayette was no longer invited to the banquets, dances, and hunting trips at which he had previously been a regular guest. This attitude of hostility and suspicion was by no means mutual, though. Lafayette never ceased professing his absolute loyalty to the king and the queen. He was not so naive to think that this would absolve him in their eyes, as he explained in a letter to Washington, quote, "They do not forgive me the liberties that I've taken," end quote. At one dinner hosted by the Comte de Provence, a brother of Louis XVI, the prince all but accused Lafayette of plotting high treason, asking him, quote, "You're a Republican, then. Does that mean that you approve of the execution of King Charles?" End quote. The prince was, of course, referring to King Charles I of England, who, in 1649, was convicted of treason and beheaded following the defeat of his faction in the English Civil War. Evidently, monarchists across Europe were still rather scandalized by his execution even over a century later. In response to the prince's rather leading question, Lafayette conjured up some statement about how he was opposed to capital punishment in general. which was unconvincing. As a point of fact, despite his very vocal liberal sympathies, Lafayette was not actually a Republican, at least not at this juncture. Lafayette had always believed that a constitutional monarchy was the ideal form of government, and that by working towards this end, he was trying to help the monarchy, not to harm it. He still believed that the king's true nature was benevolent, and that he was just being led astray by corrupt elements within his inner circle. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. As I said, the Assembly of Notables did not immediately result in any great political changes, and yet many contemporary observers understood that this had been a highly significant event nonetheless. For the first time in living memory, the absolute authority of the French monarchy had been directly challenged by its own subjects, and the monarchy's ineffectual response laid bare its deficiencies. Change in one form or another was imminent. Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, a liberal economist, contended that, practically speaking, this change had already occurred. Quote, "On the 1st of May, France was still a monarchy. On the 9th of May, France became a republic, in which there remains a magistrate decorated with the title and honors of royalty, but forever obliged to assemble his people to ask them to supply his wants, for which the public revenue without national consent will forever be inadequate." End quote. Writing to a historian friend of his, Lafayette stated, quote, "You would do well to begin your history of France with the year 1787, end quote. Like Dupont, Lafayette believed that the first steps towards a liberal government had been taken. Writing to Washington about 5 months after the Assembly adjourned, Lafayette described the situation in France in a tone that bordered on excitement. Quote, "The fiscal problems in this country remain unresolved. We have to cover an enormous deficit with new taxes, but the nation is reluctant to pay for what it has not voted. The notions of liberty have propagated rapidly since the American Revolution. The Assembly of Notables set fire to combustible materials. A war of words has erupted in the press. The people jeer at the Comte d'Artois and burn several ministers in effigy. The discontent has become so widespread that the Queen no longer dares come to Paris for fear of being mistreated. The events of the last 6 months have impressed upon everyone that the King no longer reserves the right to tax the nation unless such taxes are stipulated by the nation." End quote. Constantly seeking advice, or perhaps just affirmation from his idol, Lafayette's correspondence with Washington became noticeably more frequent in this period. Washington's response to the particular message I just read a minute ago came along with a copy of the new proposed Constitution of the United States. On May 25, 1787, which was coincidentally the same day that the Assembly of Notables was dissolved, the first Constitutional Convention opened in Philadelphia. In the course of 4 months, 55 delegates representing each of the 13 states tried to devise a new foundational document upon which the government of the United States of America would be premised. It was a long, occasionally contentious process, but by mid-September they had managed to arrive at a compromise that most, not all, the delegates could agree to. Replying to Washington in January 1788, Lafayette expresses admiration for the document. Quote, "It is needless for me to tell you that I have read the proposed new Constitution with an unspeakable eagerness and attention. I have admired it, and find in it a bold, large, and solid frame for the Confederation." End quote. Naturally, he saw this achievement as an example to emulate in France, telling Washington, quote, "For my part, I am heartily wishing for a Constitution and a Bill of Rights, and wish it may be effected with as much tranquility and mutual satisfaction as is possible." End quote. Lafayette's friend, Thomas Jefferson, cautioned him against trying to emulate the American model too closely. Instead, he encouraged him to look to Great Britain, of all places, for inspiration. He admitted that the British model may not be perfect, but since more similarities existed between Britain and France than either would like to admit, it would simply be more prudent to follow their example. In any case, Lafayette had gotten the notion into his head that what France needed was a constitution, and as always with him, once this was in his head, it would be impossible to get it out. In the autumn of 1788, Lafayette joined and subsequently helped to lead a self-described constitutional club, along with like-minded members of the nobility. Initially called the Society of 30, the group quickly expanded beyond its initial 30 members and became one of the largest political clubs in the country. Among its members were many individuals who would become pivotal figures in the coming revolution, such as Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Comte de Mirabeau, the Marquis de Condorcet, the Abbé Sieyès, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, and of course, Lafayette. The group also counted Thomas Jefferson as an honorary member. He would write of the Society of 30, quote, "This party comprehended all the honesty of the kingdom, sufficiently at its leisure to think. the men of letters, the bourgeois, and the young nobility." End quote. This was really more of a debate club than a political party. Its members would meet twice a week to discuss the issues of the day, and since it was a politically heterogeneous group, there were often spirited debates that went on for hours at a time. Insofar as the group had a political agenda, Lafayette described it in the following terms, quote, "We hope to create a sufficient degree of fermentation to produce the threat of civil war, though without letting it materialize. In the army, enough patriotism to worry about the state of the government without causing actual disobedience. In the collection of taxes, a sufficient number of obstacles to lead us to capitulation, though not to bankruptcy. The general effect of all of this will lead us, by the shortest possible road, to the winning of that constitutional liberty for which other countries have not thought torrents of blood in 100 years of wars and misfortunes are too high of a price to pay." End quote. In other words, Lafayette and his noble co-conspirators thought that by pushing the kingdom just to the brink of total collapse, they could enact the reforms that they desired without plunging the nation into the deluge of revolutionary violence that usually accompanied such massive political changes. An ambitious plan indeed, so ambitious as to almost seem hubristic in retrospect. They were dealing with forces more powerful than they were able to fully comprehend, and once those forces were unleashed, it would be practically impossible to contain them. With the failure of the Assembly of Notables, the Crown tried to force the Parlement to pass a new slate of taxes in a last-ditch effort to stave off bankruptcy. Spearheading this effort was Etienne Charles de Brienne, a former archbishop who assumed leadership of the Ministry of Finance after Cologne's dismissal. Very quickly, Brienne learned that his predecessor's hesitancy to deal with the Parlement was well-founded. Just as Cologne had feared, the Parlement, especially that of Paris, were unwilling to approve of the new taxes. At first, Brienne took the diplomatic route. It took 2 months of fruitless negotiations to convince him that this was a dead end. When subsequent attempts by the king to use his authority to force the Parlement's compliance failed, on August 15th, Brienne ordered each of its members arrested and forcibly exiled from Paris to the city of Troyes. His intention here was not to disband the Parlement outright, but to coerce it into compliance. If this could not be achieved, however, Brienne had a contingency in place. One of the few actual achievements of the Assembly of Notables had been to approve the formation of elected assemblies at the provincial level that would at least be partially responsible for assessing and collecting taxes. The Crown had assented to the creation of these assemblies under the assumption that they would be easier to manipulate than the Parlement. When the provincial assemblies began convening for preliminary sessions in August 1787, Lafayette went to his native Auvergne to participate in the proceedings. A royal directive from Versailles stipulated that the Auvergne Assembly was to furnish the crown with 2 million livres. This demand did not go over well with the Auvergne Assembly or any of the other provincial assemblies that were convening throughout the kingdom, for that matter. They refused to comply until the crown undertook comprehensive reforms to the royal budget. This stance was popularized by the rallying cry of "No reforms, no taxes." The full sessions of the provincial assemblies held in October and November did not lead to any different outcome. In the official statement drafted by Lafayette, the Auvergne Assembly concluded that even if they did want to comply with the Crown's demand for 2 million livres, they could not, since they were only able to raise 1.3 million in tax revenue. New taxes had to be levied, and they refused to levy new taxes unless they were approved of by the whole nation. This could only be accomplished by the convocation of the Estates General. Meanwhile, Brienne's gambit with the Parlement of Paris appeared briefly as though it might pay off. The exiled councillors of the Parlement were allowed to return to Paris, and in exchange, they agreed to temporarily renew the 20e tax and approved a new series of loans. There was a mutual understanding that both of these measures would only be in effect for up to 5 years. Remarkably, Brienne agreed to convene the Estates General before this period elapsed. Ideally, Brienne hoped to buy the crown enough time to resolve the financial situation on their own, and that ultimately there'd be no need to make good on this promise. On November 19th, the king, his ministers, and the Parlement of Paris met in the Palais de Justice in Paris to finalize the terms of their agreement. Everything was going according to plan until suddenly, Louis deviated from the prepared script, bluntly stating his refusal to negotiate or compromise with the Parlement, simply ordering the councillors to accede to his demands. It has been suggested that the king was encouraged to reassert his royal authority by his more conservative advisors, who warned him that he was in danger of losing this authority altogether if he continued to allow elements within his own kingdom to undermine him. Whatever the reason for Louis's sudden defiance, everyone present was stunned for a moment. before the king's cousin, Louis Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans, voiced his objection, telling Louis, quote, "Your Majesty, I consider this to be illegal," end quote. Louis retorted simply, quote, "It is legal because I've already heard everyone's opinions," end quote. The next day, the king had Orléans exiled from Paris for his little performance. King Louis and his cousin, Duke Louis Philippe, had never really seen eye to eye. An open break between the two had been a long time coming. Despite being a prince of the blood and one of the wealthiest individuals in the kingdom to boot, Orléans held liberal political views, and did not exactly make a secret of this. In 1785, Orléans inherited the title and properties of his deceased father. Among the latter was a large palace complex in Paris, adjacent to the Louvre, called the Palais Royal. Magnanimously, Orléans had turned the palace into a public forum for the citizens of Paris. He built shops, cafes, salons, and, crucially, newsstands, and allowed the people to engage in whatever sorts of activities they desired, legal or otherwise, outside the purview of the authorities. Revolutionary pamphlets, political tracts, radical journals, and all other kinds of illicit printed materials were distributed from the Palais Royal, all with the Duke's tacit approval. This had given Orléans a reputation as an outspoken radical, even if, for the most part, he let others do the writing on his behalf. Like the other direct relatives of the king at court, Orléans had, up to that moment, adhered to an unspoken agreement to not contradict His Majesty's will in public, which made his interjection against the king's blatantly autocratic action all the more remarkable. Louis's decision to have him arrested and exiled only served to enhance Orléans' credibility as a liberal champion of the common man, and to further diminish the popularity of the royal family. With the king's refusal to cooperate with the Parlement, and the provincial assemblies also non-compliant, Brienne was left with few options. In May 1788, the Prime Minister persuaded the king to issue a number of edicts intended to help resolve the crisis, one of which would have abolished the Parlement altogether. News of this latest attempt at royal overreach prompted a wave of popular protests across France. In an incident that presaged the violence to come, on June 7, 1788, the residents of Grenoble, a town in southeastern France, attacked the king's soldiers with roof tiles, among other objects, when they attempted to forcibly disperse the local parlement, in what has since been dubbed the Day of the Tiles. Meanwhile, the nobles of Brittany, a province in the northwestern corner of the kingdom, chose to express their disapproval of the king's latest action via petition. Historically, the Breton aristocracy had enjoyed a large degree of regional autonomy, including the right to be exempted from certain royal decrees. They feared that with this latest decree, the king was seeking to deprive them of their traditional rights. In May, a group of concerned Breton nobles arrived at Lafayette's Parisian residence to enlist his assistance. Although he had been born and raised in Auvergne, Lafayette was technically a member of the Breton nobility, as his mother's family originally hailed from that region, and he still owned a considerable amount of property there. Lafayette affixed his signature to their petition without hesitation. 2 months later, when 12 of these nobles presented their petition to Louis XVI, the king had them all arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille. Lafayette protested their innocence, which prompted a reprimand from Marie Antoinette, who sternly told him that the affairs of Brittany were none of his business. To this, Lafayette retorted, quote, "But I am a Breton, just as your Majesty is an Austrian," end quote. The queen was irate, and saw to it that Lafayette was punished for his insolence by stripping him of the prestigious military rank that had been awarded to him after Yorktown. This official disgrace did not seem to give Lafayette great cause for despair. He stood by his actions, saying, quote, "I associate myself with every opposition to arbitrary acts, present or future, which threaten or may threaten the rights of the nation," end quote. Some of Lafayette's more radical friends and associates had a different read on the situation. They saw Lafayette's actions taken on behalf of the Breton nobles as a reactionary defense of aristocratic privileges. The Marquis de Condorcet wrote a concerned letter to a mutual friend, imploring him to remind the Marquis where his true convictions lay. Quote, "If you go to Lafayette's house, try to exorcise the devil of aristocracy that will be there to tempt him in the guise of a councillor of Parlement or a noble from Brittany. Take along with you a small vial of water from the Potomac, a sprinkler made with the wood of a Continental Army rifle, and make your prayers in the name of liberty, equality, and reason, which are but a single divinity in 3 persons." End quote. Condorcet was not the only one of Lafayette's compatriots who were concerned with what they saw as his insufficient faith in the cause. This would be a recurring theme in the years to come, as Lafayette's opponents to the right of him would believe him to be too radical, while those to his left thought him to be too conservative. The crisis that faced France came to a head in August 1788. As of that month, the crown was officially bankrupt. There was not enough money in the treasury to cover even daily expenses. Brienne, having exhausted all of his options, resigned as Minister of Finance on the 25th. Louis XVI then appointed Jacques Necker to reassume his former office. Now make no mistake, the king was not particularly fond of Necker, nor did he have the utmost confidence in his ability to resolve the financial crisis. Necker was loathed by most people at court, especially the Queen and the Comte d'Artois, who were not afraid to voice these opinions to the king. That said, Necker was practically the only person associated with the government that was still widely respected by the general public. One of his first acts back in office was to finally convince the king to convene the Estates General in the upcoming spring. It could simply no longer be avoided. For Lafayette and the other members of the Society of 30, the convening of the Estates General had the potential to bring them closer to achieving their goals, namely the adoption of a constitution, without having to resort to violence. From the outset, however, there appeared to be a number of obstacles that had the potential to complicate things, the most readily apparent of which being the structure of the Estates General itself. As I've stated before and must re-emphasize here, the Estates General was emphatically not a truly democratic, truly representative institution, nor was it intended to be. It was, at a fundamental level, an archaic, feudal institution, and its structure reflected this reality. To explain in greater depth, the Estates General was organized around the three estates, which were understood to comprise French society at the time. The first estate consisting of the clergy, the second estate of the nobility, and the third estate consisting of the commoners, that is to say, everyone else who did not fall into either of the two aforementioned categories. The issue lay in the fact that each estate was afforded one collective vote, which meant that the first two estates, whose interests were more often than not aligned with the state and with each other, could always outvote the third. The last time the Estates General was convened was in 1614, exactly 175 years ago, and it should suffice to say that French society had undergone some changes during that period. This archaic system, which allowed the nobility and the clergy, which together comprised roughly 5% of the population, to overrule the will of everyone else, was perceived as being undemocratic, and rightfully so. A nationwide debate ensued regarding whether the rules of the Estates General should be changed, and if so, how. The solution trotted out by Lafayette and his friends in the Society of 30 was to double the number of delegates representing the Third Estate and to conduct votes on an individual rather than collective basis. These demands were succinctly encapsulated by the slogan of, quote, "Double the third, vote by head," end quote. Both the king and Necker were hesitant to implement any changes. Necker's temporary solution was to reconvene the Assembly of Notables in December and defer to their judgment. The Assembly voted overwhelmingly to keep the current rules. In December, the king, against the advice of both the Assembly of Notables and his own brothers, declared that the Third Estate would be allowed double representation, but said nothing of the other half of their demand, the whole voting by head part. This was a compromise that ultimately pleased none and upset all. Making matters even worse, throughout the year 1788, France had been affected by a succession of environmental disasters. In spring, there was a drought, followed by a massively destructive hailstorm in July that ruined the forthcoming harvest. The nation faced near-famine conditions as winter approached, and, as it turned out, the winter of 1788 into 1789 happened to be the most severe in recent memory. The Crown took some measures to alleviate the situation, but it was not enough. Bread riots and labor unrest became endemic. Thus, the prevailing mood of the French nation on the eve of the Estates General was one of fear, anger, and distrust. Lafayette and the Society of 30 sought to harness these sentiments and to use them to further their political agenda. Throughout the winter, the Society facilitated the publication of a number of articles intended to help guide public discourse. In the run-up to the convening of the Estates General, the king had the censorship laws relaxed somewhat, so that his subjects could compile lists of their grievances to be presented to the delegates for their consideration. For the vast majority of people in France, this was the first time that they had been officially invited to participate, however indirectly, in the affairs of government. The Society of 30 drew up and published a number of pamphlets explaining these complicated political matters to the uninitiated. In March 1789, Lafayette traveled once more to his home province of Auvergne to secure from the Provincial Assembly his nomination to represent the province at the Estates General. Despite his widespread popularity among the commoners there, Lafayette faced a more difficult time dealing with his fellow nobles than he perhaps expected. Upon his arrival, he wrote, quote, Division and jealousy exist here. I have the disadvantage of an audience warned and prepared against my opinions." End quote. The nobles of the Provincial Assembly agreed to back Lafayette's nomination only on the condition that he would not support any changes to the structure of the Estates General unless the king first expressed his approval. In essence, he was being forced to vote against his convictions. The day before the opening session of the Estates General, Jefferson wrote to Lafayette, offering him advice on how to conduct himself going forward. Quote, "As it becomes more and more possible that the nobles will go wrong, I become uneasy for you. Your principles are decidedly with the Third Estate, but your instructions are against them." End quote. Jefferson warned Lafayette against trying to balance the interests of the Second and Third Estates, and encouraged him to take the course of action that his true beliefs compelled him to. Quote, "You will, in the end, go wholly over to the Third Estate, because it will be impossible for you to live in a constant sacrifice of your own sentiments. But you would be received by the Third Estate at any future day coldly and without confidence. This appears to me to be the moment to take at once that honest and manly stand with them that your principles dictate." End quote. The eyes of the entire French nation turned to Versailles on May 5th, 1789. It was on that morning that, after months of anticipation, the Estates General finally assembled. Before the 1,200 delegates could actually get down to business, all of the proper ceremonies and protocols had to be followed, lest the Crown create the mistaken impression that the Estates General in any way constituted a real break with precedent. The Menu Plaisir du Roi was once again chosen as the venue. The king himself led the opening procession, of course, flanked on either side by his two brothers. After him came the queen and the two royal princesses, followed by a long line of courtiers and government ministers. One observer remarked that while the procession was extravagant, the royal couple clearly resented having to be there. Quote, "Neither the king nor queen appear too well pleased. While the former is repeatedly hailed and saluted whenever he passes by, the latter meets not a single acclamation. She looks contemptuously on at the scene of which she is a part, as if to say, 'I submit now, but I shall have my turn.'" End quote. The nobility and clergy, dressed in their best finery, processed in after the court. The members of the Third Estate, not permitted to participate in the ceremony, were made to enter through a side door. The message sent by this symbolic humiliation was clear. Writing less than a century later, historian Jules Michelet castigated Louis XVI for, quote, "resurrecting the odious details of a Gothic ceremony, the oppression of the classes, those signs of social distinction and hatred that he should rather have consigned to oblivion." End quote. The king took his seat upon a throne, which itself sat on a hastily built wooden platform, the shoddy construction work concealed by velvet curtains and gold paint. Again, the irony here should be self-evident. To either side, the delegates of the First and Second Estates were seated in rows running perpendicular to the throne. Then, at the far opposite end of the hall, directly facing the king, were seated the delegates of the Third Estate. Again, the implicit meaning of the seating arrangement was not lost on anyone. The king's opening address, delayed after a brief mishap when an aide discovered he'd misplaced the script, was unremarkable and entirely perfunctory. Necker then took the floor and proceeded to explain the kingdom's financial situation at excruciating length. The acoustics in the massive hall were less than ideal, and everyone in attendance struggled to keep up throughout the 3-hour-long speech. The actual proceedings of the Estates General were supposed to get underway the following day, but things got off to a precarious start. When the delegates were instructed to reconvene in separate meeting chambers designated for each separate estate, the representatives of the Third Estate voiced their objections. After all, the whole debate as to how the Estates General should be organized had never been conclusively settled. Yes, the Assembly of Notables had voted in favor of maintaining the traditional rules, but it must be remembered that since it had no enumerated legislative powers, its pronouncements carried no legal weight. The king had the final say in such matters, but he refused to weigh in decisively on this debate, leaving the question unresolved. The delegates of the Third Estate insisted that there be no official distinctions made between the delegates of the different estates, and that the Estates General should be one unitary body in which individual votes would be given equal weight. Until these changes were implemented, the delegates of the Third Estate refused to participate in the proceedings. Lafayette was now beginning to acutely feel the pressure of the situation. Jefferson, sensing the direction that things weren't going in, encouraged him to break ranks and join the Third Estate immediately. Quote, "By joining the Third Estate now, you could win their hearts forever, be approved by the world, which marks and honors a man of the people, and will be an external consolation to yourself." End quote. There's little doubt that if he had felt free to follow his convictions that he would have, but he had already offered his pledge to the Provincial Assembly of Auvergne that he would remain with the Second Estate. Lafayette, struggling to somehow reconcile his ideological principles with political realities, was paralyzed by indecision. With the refusal of the Third Estate to participate unless their demands were met, and the refusal of the other two estates to reach any sort of compromise, the proceedings of the Estates General came to a screeching halt. Several days passed, then weeks, with no end to the deadlock in sight. Make no mistake, just because no progress was being made, this does not mean that the delegates simply sat idle and twiddling their thumbs. They were constantly arguing with each other, gossiping and engaging in interpersonal intrigues that were ultimately inconsequential. One delegate of the Second Estate, the Marquis de Lafayette, complained in a letter to his wife, quote, "The animosity between the orders is tremendous. The orders are neither in accord within themselves nor with each other." End quote. Before long, an entire month had elapsed. At this juncture, it seemed that only the intervention of the king could resolve the dispute, but as he so often did in these situations, the king did not act. On the 4th of June, his son, Louis Joseph, the Dauphin, the title for the French crown prince, died at just 7 years old. Stricken with grief, Louis, an inconspicuous figure in public affairs even in the best of times, withdrew further into his seclusion. With the king out of the equation more or less entirely, the cracks in the edifice began to show. On June 10th, the Abbé Sieyès, a liberal clergyman and prominent political theorist, motioned to issue an ultimatum to the other estates, essentially stating that the Third Estate intended to proceed with or without them. On June 12th, 3 clergymen declared their intention to leave the First Estate to join the Third. This triggered a wave of further defections. The next day, 6 more clergy joined the Third Estate, and this trend continued until, by the 19th, enough of them had followed suit that the First Estate voted by a narrow margin to collectively join with the Third. With these changes, the Third Estate was able to claim, not unreasonably, that they represented something greater than simply just the commoners. They constituted a new political body, and they felt that they should adopt a new title to reflect this. After some debate, the name that they decided on was the National Assembly, which they voted to unilaterally adopt on June 17th. One of the primary figures moving these events forward was Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, the Comte de Mirabeau, someone who I've referenced a couple of times in passing already, but deserves a more thorough introduction, since he'll become rather prominent in our narrative going forward. Born in 1749 to a noble family in the Provence region of southeastern France, Mirabeau had spent much of his early life engaging in all manner of debauchery, seducing married women left and right, moving like a vagabond from country to country to evade the law, all the while managing to rack up such a huge mountain of debt that even other noblemen, practically all of whom were in debt to some degree or another, considered his spending habits irresponsible. The law did eventually catch up with him in 1777, and he spent the next 4 years imprisoned in the castle of Vincennes, just outside Paris. Tangentially, another famous, or to be more precise, infamous, libertine was interred there at the same time, the Marquis de Sade, from whose name the term sadism was derived. Back to Mirabeau, during his stint in prison he wrote a tract arguing that his confinement was both unjust and illegal. It was published after his release, and was the first clear demonstration of Mirabeau's knowledge of legal and political matters, and more importantly of his rhetorical ability, thus beginning a new career for him in politics. In the years leading up to the Estates General, Mirabeau built up a reputation in his native Provence, and to an extent outside of it, as a sort of champion of the common people. His ability to hold the sway of the public enabled him to be elected to the Estates General as a representative of the Third Estate, despite the fact that he was a nobleman. Historians are still divided as to whether Mirabeau was an actual populist with genuine political convictions, or if he was simply a venal demagogue whose only true ambition was to exploit the political moment to enhance his fame and fortune. In any case, books on the French Revolution almost invariably make a point to remark on his abnormal physical appearance. For instance, this passage from Schama's book Citizens, quote, "Sheer size singled out Mirabeau, a mountain of flesh and muscle crammed with difficulty into a black coat and hose. His remarkable height was accentuated by celebrated bolts of hair that led some to compare this shaggy brute with the biblical Samson, who drew strength from his locks. Others said he resembled a tiger, whose expression was disfigured in a snarl when he sounded off. His huge face was pitted with dark holes, scabs, and craters, the result of a bout of smallpox he suffered in childhood." End quote. Mirabeau's remarkable success in winning such widespread acclamation, despite what Schama goes on to describe as his, quote, stupendous ugliness, end quote, is, I think, a testament to the strength of his ability. Lafayette, who first crossed paths with Mirabeau in the Society of 30, regarded him with suspicion from the beginning, writing of him, quote, Mirabeau's immorality shocked me. Though I found much pleasure in his conversation and felt great admiration for his outstanding gifts, I could not help but adopt an attitude of contempt, end quote. In due course, Lafayette and Mirabeau would come to regard each other as rivals, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. On the morning of June 20th, 1789, the day after the First Estate had voted to collectively join the delegates of the former Third Estate, now calling themselves the National Assembly, the delegates arrived outside the meeting chamber to find that the doors were locked and guarded by armed soldiers. They were told that the building was being renovated for a royal session that was to be held later that week. This was, in fact, not untrue, but the delegates of the National Assembly, physically barred from entering their meeting chamber and standing outside in the pouring rain, assumed the worst, that the king intended to prevent the merging of the First and Third Estates as a prelude to dissolving the assembly outright. And so they decided to reconvene at the nearest convenient location, which happened to be a spacious indoor tennis court. There they all swore an oath to both God and the nation to continue meeting until they had established a constitution for France. The oath was administered by Jean-Sylvain Bailly, an astronomer turned politician who will become an important figure in our narrative in short order. This event, the tennis court oath, was a pivotal moment in history. Some consider it to mark the beginning of the French Revolution, though this is somewhat contentious. In any event, Lafayette had, much to his anguish, played no part in it, bound as he was by his own oath to the Provincial Assembly of Auvergne. Following a thwarted attempt to dissolve the National Assembly on June 27th, Louis XVI ordered the other two estates dissolved, and for the clergy and nobility to join the Third Estate in the National Assembly. By doing this, the king effectively legitimized the body, thereby releasing Lafayette from his obligations and finally allowing him to participate. Since the stated mandate of the National Assembly was to create a constitution, Lafayette immediately got to work on this project. Specifically, over the course of the next 2 weeks, he would work tirelessly on a Declaration of Rights that he intended to serve as a foundation of a constitution. To further clarify, the list that Lafayette would present to the Assembly in the second week of July 1789 had not been devised entirely in the course of just the last 2 weeks. In fact, he'd been working on it since January, in anticipation of the Estates General. The results of the Estates General, however, had given new urgency to this project, to finalize, edit, and proofread his list before presenting it to the Assembly. For this task, he enlisted the assistance of Thomas Jefferson, who was more than happy to lend his expertise to this project. In a letter written to his close friend and confidant, the Madame de Simeon, the day before he planned to present this work to the Assembly, Lafayette explained why he was so determined to not let this moment pass him by. Quote, "It is natural that when 1,200 Frenchmen are at work trying to write a constitution, that I should wish to be one of them, no matter how anxious I may be to do my duty." End quote. The document that Lafayette would present to the National Assembly on July 11th was, of course, the initial draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a hugely important document in the history of France and of the world. Since it's so significant, and since our protagonist was so instrumental in its creation, I think it's worth discussing it at some length. To begin with, it's worth reiterating that the Declaration was not a constitution by itself. It was intended to be the preamble to a future constitution. Like the preamble to the American Constitution that more listeners may be familiar with, the Declaration did not enumerate the powers assigned to the government, nor did it outline how the government should be structured or how it should function. Instead, it was more of a statement of the basic principles on which the Constitution should be based. Lafayette's draft of the Declaration consisted of 13 points. The first of these reads, quote, "Nature made men free and equal. The distinctions between them are based on the general utility." End quote. This statement is perhaps the most succinct distillation of the document's ethos. And while today this is something that we take for granted, one has to remember that this notion, that all human beings are, according to the laws of nature, innately equal, challenged the foundation on which the social order in France was built. Anyway, this first article was one of the few that made it into the final draft, more or less unaltered. Article 2 reads, quote, "Every man is born with inalienable rights, such as the right of property, the care of his honor and of his life, the entire disposition of his person, of his industry, and all his faculties, the search for well-being and resistance to oppression, end quote. The exact wording here is somewhat clunky, but its resemblance to the oft-quoted phrase from the American Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is not at all coincidental. One can see Jefferson's fine hand at work here. Article 2 was a non-exhaustive list of natural rights, rights afforded to all human beings, which are universal, fundamental, and inalienable. Moving on, Article 3 reads, quote, "The exercise of natural rights has no limits except those which ensure the same rights to society," end quote. If the meaning of this is somewhat unclear, it would eventually be rendered in the final document into something a bit more easily comprehensible. Quote, "Liberty consists in the power to do anything that does not injure others. Accordingly, the exercise of the natural rights of each man enjoys no limits except those that secure to the other members of society the enjoyment of these same rights. These limits can be determined only by law," end quote. Skipping ahead a bit, Article 6 reads, quote, "The principle of all sovereignty resides imprescriptibly in the nation. No body and no individual can have an authority which does not expressly emanate from the nation," end quote. I'd like to point out here that in this context, the word nation is being used in the strictest sense of the word, referring to the body of people that constitute it, and not as a synonym for the state or the country, as is common today. The idea put forth in this article, that a popular sovereignty, was in direct opposition to the notion that a ruler derives their legitimacy from God, the divine right of kings, as it is often called. Anyway, the articles that I just outlined here are the most important, and would find their way into the final document with minimal changes. If we were to discuss each of the 13 articles in Lafayette's original draft and how they were subsequently revised, we'd probably be here all day. So, to briefly summarize, the remaining articles pertain to concepts like freedom of speech, religious tolerance, consent of the governed, separation of powers, equality before the law, standardization of taxes, and so on. I'd like to emphasize once again that the version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen that Lafayette presented to the National Assembly on July 11th was only a draft. Several revisions would be made to it over the course of the next several weeks before the Assembly finally voted to ratify it in late August, with the text of the final version usually being credited to Mirabeau and the Abbé CS. Nonetheless, some credit is due to Lafayette and Jefferson for their work on the initial proposal. On a personal level, Lafayette took immense pride in writing the Declaration, proclaiming it to be one of the proudest achievements of his life. He later described it as, quote, "a profession of my faith, the fruit of my past and a pledge of my future. It is at the same time a manifesto and an ultimatum," end quote. For Lafayette, this document represented the culmination of years of political education, the tangible result of his attempts to formulate a coherent philosophy. Lafayette's detractors would cast all manner of aspersions on his political convictions, or lack thereof in some cases. The most two common lines of critique were that the Marquis was either insincere in his beliefs, or that he was too ignorant to have such beliefs to begin with. And while I won't try to claim that Lafayette was without faults, he absolutely was not, I think that his authorship of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proves that he was not, in fact, ignorant. His perceived insincerity, on the other hand, was the result of his inability to reconcile his philosophical beliefs with political realities, which has been and will continue to be a major theme in the narrative. In the immediate term, though, Lafayette's outlook for France's future was rather optimistic, as evidenced by another letter he wrote to the Madame de Sémillon, that reads in part, quote, "I have tried everything short of civil war, which I could have accomplished except that I feared its horrors. A year ago, I developed a plan whose simplest points seemed like extravagancies, and which will, 6 months from now, be executed in its entirety. I have created a Declaration of Rights, which Mr. Jefferson and I found to be so satisfactory that he had it sent to General Washington. This declaration, or something like it, will be the catechism of France," end quote. Lafayette seems to have been under the impression that large-scale violence could still somehow be avoided. Why exactly he thought this way is beyond me. Perhaps he was just too caught up in the moment to realize that the nation was already beginning to be torn asunder. In his defense, he wasn't the only one. Jefferson was of a similar mind, writing in an overly self-congratulatory letter to Madison, quote, "I think it is probable this country will, within 2 or 3 years, be in the enjoyment of a tolerably free constitution, and without it having to cost them a drop of blood," end quote. Someone who certainly did not share Lafayette and Jefferson's optimism was their mutual acquaintance, a New York lawyer and statesman named Governor Maurice. Before anyone gets confused here, Governor was the man's legal given name, and not a title. He was not, nor had he ever held, the office of governor. As of 1789, the highest office that Maurice had ever held was delegate to the Continental Congress. Anyway, as a signatory of both the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, Maurice is considered one of the founding fathers of the United States, even if he's not the most well-known among them. After losing re-election to Congress in 1789, Maurice went to France for unspecified business purposes, and soon after fell in with Jefferson and the other American expats who frequently visited Lafayette's residence. Maurice's true intention was most likely to take over Jefferson's position as ambassador to France, which he eventually did in 1792. He kept a very detailed diary during this time, which is a useful first-hand account of the Revolution, even if his cynical, conservative worldview often makes it a tedious read. To that point, Maurice was highly critical of the Declaration. After previewing the document at an Independence Day celebration that was held at Jefferson's house that year, he warned Lafayette that his attempt to introduce American-style liberty to France was short-sighted, and that this would result either in tyranny or anarchy. From his journal, quote, "Our American example has done them good, but like all novelties, liberty runs away with their discretion, if they have any. They want an American constitution, with the exception of a king instead of a president, without reflecting that they have not American citizens to support that constitution. Different constitutions of government are necessary to different societies. A democracy? In France? Can that last? I think not. In fact, I am sure not, unless the entire people are changed." End quote. Ultimately, Maurice's cynical outlook on the situation would be vindicated by the course of events, because, as we'll soon see, the revolution was not over. Far from it. In fact, it hadn't truly begun, because the king, or to be more precise, the clique of ultra-royalists who surrounded him, was determined not to take these most recent affronts to the crown's authority sitting down. They were quietly plotting to dismiss the troublesome finance minister Necker and to dissolve the National Assembly. Meanwhile, in Paris, public order had been steadily deteriorating since April. The streets were abuzz with revolutionary fervor, and rumors had been circulating for weeks now that the forces of counter-revolution were plotting to strike back. To use a somewhat tired analogy, the city of Paris was like a powder keg, and it would take only a spark, the slightest provocation, to set it off. On July 12th, the very next day after Lafayette presented his draft of the Declaration to the National Assembly, the people would get their provocation. But for now, I'm afraid this episode has gone on for quite long enough. And so in the next episode, we'll shift our narrative from Versailles to Paris, where the revolution will begin in earnest after the storming of the Bastille, and where we will continue to follow Lafayette as the hands of fate once more push him into a position where he had the potential to alter the course of history. But you'll have to tune in again in 2 weeks to hear the next chapter. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or anything else that you'd like for me to address, please don't hesitate to send me an email at perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also reach me on Twitter or Facebook. Links to both sites will be in the episode's description, as well as a link to the show's website. If you like the show, please consider leaving a review or a rating for it on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer to use. Also, consider purchasing some used books from me on eBay. A link will be available in the description as well. Anyway, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
Ça ira, réjouissons-nous, le beau temps viendra. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Par les flambeaux de l'auguste assemblée. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Le peuple abri toujours se gardera. Le vrai d'avec le faux l'on connaîtra. Le citoyen pour le bien soutiendra. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira. Quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au début ira. Sans avoir à le troubler, toujours le plus fort sera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, le peuple